This is the OEM version of the Radeon HD 2900 XTX. It's one of my most desired video cards of all time, not because of its legendary performance or the fact that it made a huge impact on the GPU world. Actually, it's very much the opposite. The 2900 XTX didn't exactly meet expectations during development, and because of that it was cancelled and never released into consumer channels. Think of it as ATI's unreleased version of the FX 5800 Ultra. On April 26, 2007, Daily Tech got a hold of an OEM version of the 2900 XTX. Hardware enthusiasts got a taste of the would-be Flagship's performance, and unfortunately for ATI, the aspiring Flagship couldn't keep pace with Nvidia's 8800 GTX. To make matters worse, the XTX saw minimal gains when compared to the 2900 XT. Delving into the article a bit deeper shows the XTX with a conservative 750 MHz core clock, along with a 2020 MHz effective memory clock on the 1GB of GDDR4. While Daily Tech selected an overclocked 8800 GTX for the comparison, a reference clock GTX would have no problem laying waste to ATI's offerings. Because of this dismal performance, board partners were not willing to produce the XTX in any meaningful capacity. So while it never saw the light of day in consumer form, ATI did produce XTXs for the OEMs to sample, and some of those cards may have been renamed and sold as 2900 XT OEM versions. While the history of the 2900 XTX is filled with so many unknowns, I did my best to research and collect as much information as I could. With that being said, the information I'm about to present would still be considered conjecture. Let's now take a look at one of the first known XTX prototypes, and these originated in mid to late 2006, and they were the first to use the R600 silicon, identified as the A11. The earliest of these cards sported an all-black tinted cooler and came equipped with 512 MB of GDDR3. Some of the later A11 revisions came with either a clear or red housing. Now these models came with 1GB of GDDR4, along with a denser copper heatsink, which would help cope with higher core clock speeds and voltages. Core clocks are said to vary depending on the revision, but the earliest samples were reported to be as low as 550 MHz. Evidently, these early prototypes were also known to be ridden with bugs and performance inefficiencies. After the A11, ATI went to work on the A12. Now these chips were sampled in late 2006 and early 2007. Evidently, a lot of the bugs from A11 were fixed, and ATI was reaching desired core clock speeds to the tune of around 800 MHz. Unfortunately, these increased core clocks came at the cost of higher power consumption, and some of the revisions also had faster Samsung memory that came clocked to the tune of 2200 MHz effective. From what I can tell, there were nearly 24 revisions for the A12, including this one, that recently sold on eBay for over $800 US. This one sports an all-black tinted cooler and has a core clock of 800 MHz and a memory clock of 2020 effective. The last known silicon found in the XTX was the A13, and while voltage and power consumption improved, ATI did not meet their target of 800 MHz within a practical power envelope. Now because of this, ATI decided to terminate work on the XTX. The A13 chips were produced in early 2007 and were used for the remainder of the 2900 series. Now the earlier A13 samples had their information etched onto the die, while the later chips had their information on the side of the tension plate. Even though consumer versions of the XTX were officially cancelled, there were still an unknown amount of OEM versions in the wild. Speaking of OEM versions, it's now time to fill you all in on my latest find. A number of weeks ago I was looking for an HD 3870X2 on eBay, and in my searches I kept seeing this HD 3870 Apple card pop up. It caught my attention because it used the same 12-inch cooler found on the elusive XTX, which I thought was kind of odd. Now after looking through some of the pics of the card, I began to realize this doesn't look anything like a 3870. It actually looks more similar to a 2900 XT, but a bit shorter PCB-wise. Anyway, I spent some time looking at 3870s for Apple computers on the internet, and they looked nothing like this card. At this point, I didn't know 100% what I was looking at, but I had a pretty good idea. I wasn't going to let this card get away, so I opened up some dialogue with the seller and begin to negotiate on the price. I did end up paying less than the asking price, so yay for me. One thing that was noticed when looking at the pictures of the card, it did appear to have an Apple-like PCIe bracket, as it's light silver in color and has numbers above each DVI port. Also, this card doesn't have an S-video output like most other XTXs, so this looks very much like a card intended for Mac. So after a week or so of waiting, I finally received this elusive card. The first thing I did was throw it into my testbed, and surprisingly the card had no problem working in Windows. I did have some driver issues from the start, but they were quickly sorted out. Next thing I did was open up GPU-Z and notice the card was running at 709 MHz on the core and 2020 effective on the 1GB of GDDR4. It appears to be common for some Apple Radeon cards to have lower clock speeds compared to their PC counterparts. For instance, the 2600 XT is 100 MHz slower on the core for Mac. The card was extremely clean, and before I tested it any further, I decided to disassemble it to get a better look under the hood. This Apple version of the XTX has only two 6-pin PEG connectors like some of the earliest prototypes, which was definitely interesting. I'm going to assume having this PEG connector configuration, along with the reduced core clocks, that Apple may have had lower power consumption in mind when requesting this card for testing. Again, this is an assumption, but the seller did mention the card was pulled from a Mac Pro that came directly from Apple, and if that's true, then it would make sense. The PCB length is around an inch shorter versus the reference XT, and most of the power delivery is here, but the orientation of the PEG connectors has changed. Now, most of the A11 and A12 samples have two fan headers just like this card, while all of the OEM XTXs that I've seen only have one. Another thing I noticed is this card is missing the Rage Theater 200 chip, which is used for Vivo, and there appears to be no need for it as this card doesn't have an S-video out. It's now time to dig into some testing. For today's test system, we're using somewhat of an age-appropriate testbed, as well as a handful of older titles. Additionally, we're using older drivers for better performance in these games. As for the cards tested, we're using the HD 2900 XT 512 and 1GB, the 8800 GTX along with the XTX. I chose to use the stock Apple clock speeds, as well as pushing the core clocks up to 756 MHz to more or less match Dailytech's XTX. So with all that said, let's jump straight into it. And the first game up in our test suite is Fear. Now, benchmarking was done using the game's built-in benchmark, and here we can see the GTX is 30% faster than the pack of Radeons. You can see the XTX doesn't distance itself from the rest of the Radeon lineup, and we did experience some inconsistent frame times with all the Radeons as well. World in Conflict is the next game we tested, and here we use the built-in benchmark to get our numbers. Here we can see the GTX pulls ahead of the XTX by a huge 55%. It's not a great showing for the Radeons in this title, and the XTX only pulls ahead of the 512 XT by 7%. Now on to Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. Benchmarking was done at the beginning of the first mission, as it's consistent and repeatable. Again, we see the GTX pull away from the XTX by 54%, which is pretty huge. I think at this point you can see why the XTX never made the cut. Next is the meme that keeps on giving. Now, we obtained our numbers using the Assault time demo found in the Crisis benchmark tool. Here the GTX leads by 23%, which bodes a bit better for the XTX. Now, these settings were a bit extreme for all of the cards tested, but it was kinda, sorta, maybe playable. And the RTS Supreme Commander is the next game up. Now, we captured 2 minutes of the built-in benchmark to get our numbers, and again, we see the beatings do continue for the Radeons, but they keep getting back up. The GTX only leads the XTX by 12% here, which is finally nice to see. And the last game we tested is Quake 4, and here we use the HOC time demo to get our numbers, and since it's a short one, we decided to only display the average FPS. We can see the GTX beats the XTX by 17%. We can also see the XTX does beat the lower tier cards here, and even the stock clock XTX holds its own. Now that we got all the games tested, let's tally them up to see how well the XTX holds up. Keep in mind this is a very small sample size and 1080p was the only resolution tested. Now the GTX ended up being 28% faster than the higher clocked XTX. Furthermore, the XTX is only 2% faster than the 2900 XT 512, and it's probably obvious at this point, but the 1GB XT is nearly on par with the XTX. Let's move on to the only synthetic test in our test suite, 3D Mark 06. And here we can see the GTX leads the XTX by 6%, while the 512MB XT achieves the best score versus the rest of the Radeons. This is pretty typical from the majority of the results that I have seen, and furthermore the base XTX doesn't put up a good showing here, clearly showing that clock speed is a huge factor here. Next, let's take a look at the entire system's power consumption using Crisis to stress our system. Now here we can see the 8800 GTX uses the least amount of power, and after that the XTX in stock form only uses 5 watts more. The 2900 XT 512 was the big pig of the bunch, while the 756MHz XTX and the 1GB XT drew the same amount of power. Now the 512MB XT card is an early engineering sample, so it might have a less mature A13 chip, which could be the reason why it draws a little bit more power, but I don't know for certain. With a cooler this huge, you might be wondering how well does it keep the GPU cool and how loud does it get? Let's first listen to the other cards to get a good base. This is the 8800 GTX. Next is the 2900 XT. This would cover both the 512 and 1GB model. Last is the XTX. Dear God, this is probably the loudest card that I own. It kind of reminds me of a muscle car, as when you push the fan speed up to 100%, it briefly stops to downshift, and you can hear that Holley double pumper like fan really start to sing. With all that noise, you would expect this mammoth cooler to keep the GPU chilly, and under load the GPU maxed out saw a temperature peak at 65°C. Keep in mind this is with a fixed fan speed of 31%. It seems the fan speed is fixed until it reaches 99°C, as shown here in the BIOS. When the fan is ramped up to 100%, temps drop into the low 50s, which is a pretty substantial drop. When comparing temps to the 2900 XT, idle temps are around the same, while load temps are much improved. Now, the XTX is the only model to come with a large 4-pipe copper heatsink, while the 2900 XT uses either a 2 or 3-pipe copper heatsink. So bringing this video to a close, we can clearly see why the XTX never saw the light of day. If ATI decided to release this card to compete against the 8800 GTX and the 8800 Ultra, it would have been a bloodbath and seriously tarnished their reputation. The fact is, the XTX was barely any faster than the 512MB XT model, and it was a good sign to can this would-be flagship. Because the XTX was never released, many thought the 2900 XT was the true contender to the crown, but it really wasn't. So you might be wondering, why is the overall performance of R600 disappointing? Well, it's likely due to a number of things. First of all, shader performance wasn't exactly strong. You would think 320 shaders would have no problem pounding NVIDIA's 128 shaders into the dirt, right? Well, they're not equal. Now, ATI was essentially taking 64 5-way shader units and marking them as 320 stream processors, even though they weren't scalar like G80s, so they couldn't process instructions on individual threads like NVIDIA's GPU. This meant NVIDIA's GPU could process more threads in parallel compared to R600's 64. Furthermore, AA is typically handled by the raster operators, otherwise known as ROPs, at the last stage of the graphics pipeline. R600 handled AA resolve on the shader hardware, which reduces both shader performance and pixel throughput. Also, one might comment on the 16 ROPs and TMUs, and this 1-to-1 ratio hasn't changed since the introduction of the X800 XT, which seems a bit bizarre for this new unified architecture. Additionally, I'm by no means done testing the XTX, and in the future I'll have a follow-up video with the entire 2900 series. There's a lot more testing to do, and I'd like to do a large-scale comparison. Well, before I end the video, I wanted to give a shout out to all the individuals shown on screen, as most of them helped with this video in one way or another. So thank you all very much.